Those who don't know me, or perhaps those whose Zoom definition is particularly poor, I am, as Phil says, Chris Gaskell. I'm Warden of the Honourable Company. And my role this evening is just simply to welcome you to this lecture. And that's a welcome not just to members of the company, but to the many guests who are joining us today. There are a lot of people from around the county who found the subject of this lecture and the speaker himself fascinating, and so we're glad to have you with us. Particular welcome to the Lord Lieutenant Edward Gillespie and Bishop Rachel, the Bishop of Gloucester. It's really good to see all of you at this public lecture. The objective of our public lecture is to give the opportunity to hear from a recognised and respected figure talking about a topic that is of relevance to the county. I think we've achieved this again this year, as the numbers attending suggest. And I'll leave it to Helen Lovett to introduce our speaker in a moment. Helen has just stepped down as Warden of the company and has, of course, stepped up to the role of High Sheriff. Helen had an excellent year as Warden, and we're very grateful for all her hard work for the company. This was to be her Wardenial lecture, so I'm very pleased that she's able to chair it. And Helen, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to you in this Zoom environment to chair our lecture today. Over to you. And you'll need to unmute.
There we are.
There you go.
There we are. Lips were moving, but you couldn't hear me. That's a result for some. Thank you to you, Chris, and I am delighted to welcome Johnathon Porritt to deliver the Gloucestershire Lecture 2020, albeit in a very different environment to the one that we planned for back in March. Johnathon needs little introduction. A resident of Cheltenham, in the 70s and 80s, he was a prominent member of the Ecology Party, which was the precursor to the Green Party. Much of what he spoke and wrote about at that time was prophetic in terms of the climate change emergency that we are now facing. Before the internet, he predicted an information-rich, knowledge-poor age. Many of the policies of the Ecology Party in the 1979 manifesto are now accepted by the mainstream political parties. Johnathon was a founding member and is now a trustee of Forum for the Future, which works internationally with governments, businesses and civil society to accelerate the shift in a sustainable future. Johnathon, enough of me. I ask members to give you a warm virtual welcome by applause and to ask you to deliver the Gloucestershire Lecture on Hope in Hell, Prospects for a Good and Sustainable Recovery. Ladies and gentlemen, Johnathon Porritt.
Helen, thank you so much. Really appreciate those generous words, and I can assure you it is just as much of an honour for me to be able to give the Gloucestershire Lecture in 2020 by Zoom as it would have been to have done it in person back in March. It's a shame not to be able to spend time with you all in person, but this is something we're getting used to, and I suspect that it will play a larger part in our lives in future, although I, for one, am getting a little bit weary of doing everything digitally and virtually right now. So this is I hope a subject of real interest to people, because we are waiting with bated breath for what has been promised as a big recovery program for the UK. We know it's coming. Prime Minister has flagged it. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, has talked about it. All ministers now are beginning to work out what they can contribute to a recovery program. So we know this is something that's going to happen. And by any rational benchmark, the prospects for it being a sustainability-friendry, climate-friendly recovery program should be really good. And I say that because, in a way, were it not for the pandemic right now, we would have carried forward the momentum from 2019 about the climate emergency, knowing that we needed to do so much more than we'd done up until that point. You may recall, it does seem a long time ago now, that the government had actually formally committed to achieving what was called a net zero economy. That means that the emissions that we put into the atmosphere are offset by our ability to trap emissions in natural systems, soils, forests, etc., etc. So net zero on the emissions front. We were the first country statutorily to commit to net zero by 2050. And many other countries have followed suit. I mean, other countries have got more ambitious dates, some 2040, but we set a bit of a sort of example there. I think it's also fair to say that by the end of 2019, there wasn't much of a debate about the science of climate change any longer. As you know, in this country, we've struggled for years with a messy, contested debate about the science, which should never have happened. It is a ridiculous thing when you look back on it. The science was actually nearly rock solid by the turn of the century. So we've had 20 years with 99% of scientists subscribing to the basic climate change hypothesis. So we also know that there is going to be a recovery program, so it's going to be big, it'll be unprecedented. It seems now that concerns about building up national debt are going to be set aside. Interest rates are so low, and the whole notion about an austerity-driven process to manage debt has temporarily been set to one side. We've also learned, and this is a big and important lesson, that the nation state, our government, is a really critical part of the total system. If you think about some of the rhetoric we've had from an ideological perspective over the last 20 years, you might have thought that the market alone would deliver everything that we needed in our societies. Well, we've undone that. We know the market is not sufficient, indeed far from it. We know that governments have to shape markets to produce the outcomes that people seek, and that a combination of the action of government, civil society, and communities is what is required to drive a better future for everybody. So that's a really crucial learning. I guess there are many, many others. We have learned, for instance, that when you carry out contingency plans into something like the inevitability of a pandemic occurring in the world at some stage over the next 20 years, and by the way, most countries did that kind of contingency planning, it makes a lot of sense to act on the findings of those contingency exercises, building resilience into the system. It's to me staggering that it was only 18 months ago that Scotland carried out a detailed study looking at what would happen if we were hit by a pandemic of the kind that we have been, and of course parked, filed, left to one side of no real interest to serving politicians who only had time for dealing with whatever crisis it was they were facing on that day, rather than preparing for the inevitability of shocks to our system in the future. So we've learned quite a lot, I think, and some of that learning has been utterly inspirational for me. We have rediscovered an extraordinary reservoir of generosity, of selflessness, of courage, of a commitment to other people, of community solidarity, if you like, which we needed reminding of. It isn't that the impulse to help others ever went away, or that people's readiness to volunteer was in any way not present in our lives for many, many years, but somehow it had become less visible than it should have been. And we have been reminded of just how incredibly powerful that is. So we don't need another pandemic to be our better selves, to be reminded of what we can do when we work together with others in our community for a bigger social purpose. And that's, I hope that learning never goes away. And we've also, of course, I think all of us been delighted to find that having air that was much more breathable because we weren't suffering from so much air pollution, to have nature back in our lives a bit through birdsong and through a sense of being closer to nature somehow. These things are all really valuable and really important. So if you just look at this completely rationally, in terms of where we were at the end of 2019, before the pandemic, all the reasons that we know now are with us today, the prospects of doing this in the right way should be absolutely brilliant. Should be. And that's because the government now knows pretty much what it has to do 5 things. It has to put purchasing power back into the economy. It has to create jobs, particularly for young people. It has to do that in a way that meets some of the structural inequalities in this country. And we've just been reminded of that all over again with the Black Lives Matter movement. It has to then, on top of those 3 things, it has to do it in a way that meets the needs of the climate emergency, that helps us address this existential threat to the well-being of humankind at some point in the future if we don't get it right. And it has to do it in a way that also meets the needs of the physical environment. We've neglected the physical environment in this country, as have all countries, in fact. So we have to put back something about restoring nature, healing some of the wounds that we've inflicted on nature over the last 4 or 5 decades. Now, when I was chair of the Sustainable Development Commission back in 1990 through to 2000, advising the Labour government, we would refer to this as policy synergies. So when you have an opportunity to make something happen that simultaneously ticks lots of other boxes, seize hold of it, because it is a beautiful thing to watch how you can achieve all sorts of different outcomes from the same policy or the same program, whatever it might be. So prospects are good. The ask is reasonable. Astonishingly, it is now enthusiastically backed by business across the nation. There may be some businesses that are in Treasury or in the Department of Business that are lobbying secretly for a different way of building back better. But out there in the public domain, every single company you can think of, including some very carbon intensive companies, are basically saying, we have to seize this moment. We won't get another moment where the public exchequer is able to put forward billions of dollars and pounds, and it will be billions, don't forget. We'll never get another opportunity to do that in the right kind of way. So what does that amount to? Let's get practical for a moment. So take something that this country has failed to do for at least 20 years, which is to develop a housing retrofit program. We have some of the poorest quality housing in the whole of Europe. We have more people living in fuel poverty than any other country in Europe. This imposes a massive cost to the NHS because poor quality housing leads to poor quality health, which then inflicts an extra burden on the NHS. We've tried different things over the years, but this is the moment where really we can get this one right. The reason why they failed all these other ones is that it had to be done via the logic of the marketplace. So the Green Deal, which was the Conservative government's big scheme for retrofitting existing housing, demanded a return on capital of 5%, a minimum of 5%. Well, it just wasn't going to work. It wasn't possible to get that kind of profit factor into a scheme which was basically about improving the lot of millions of individuals while simultaneously creating a huge outcome for society. So we can do something very special here. And the great thing about this, if you think of my 5 criteria, is this would create jobs in every constituency in the country. It would create jobs that would be particularly useful for young people, because it would be possible to train them up, provide the skills that are necessary for them to have a really good prospect in the economy of the future as they learn these skills. And it would make a massive difference in a relatively short period of time. None of these things deliver instant results, but this is a program that could make a huge difference over the next 18 months, 2 years, and on from there. Secondly, just think quickly about the state of play with our towns and cities today. We know that we've got, in many, many places, a wretched transport system that is still geared to the private motor car. The government, for instance, has a roads building program of £29 billion. That was a manifesto pledge in December last year. Well, if we spend £29 billion of public money now on building new roads, you and all the world will know that we have not only lost a lot during the pandemic, we have lost our marbles. Because this is a huge sum of money, which could now be deployed on a decentralized basis to enable local authorities, city mayors in particular, to deploy significant sums of money to help transform travel systems, transport arrangements, in such a way as to favor public transport, cycling, walking, better ways of helping people get around the place where they live and where they work. I think we all know, maybe we're all a bit zoomed out, but I think we also all know we're never going to go back to the same way of working as we had before the pandemic. It's going to look different, and it means that there will be significant flexibility in work patterns, with more people working from home for some of the time or all of the time, whatever it might be. So we don't need to spend £29 billion on massive new roads, which will only create demand for new cars, for new traffic generation, as we know. So we can do something completely different on a constituency by constituency basis. Again, jobs for people in those constituencies. And then the third example I just want to touch on, which is perhaps not so much in the news at the moment. People are talking a lot about these things. It comes under the heading of the Green New Deal. And that, of course, goes back to the original New Deal that President Roosevelt was responsible for in the 1930s in America as a massive recovery package for the Great Depression. And if you look back on it now, historically, it is a remarkable thing what he did and what America did at that time. One of the most inspiring elements in that New Deal was the Conservation Corps. And a huge amount of public money went into creating the Conservation Corps that was then deployed to do a ton of work, restoring degraded soils, planting trees, creating special areas for wildlife. It was a remarkable thing, miles ahead of its time if you think of it now. So why shouldn't we do the same now? Why shouldn't we think about the 21st century equivalent of a Conservation Corps for the UK? Again, with the prospect of putting a lot more purchasing power into the economy, rebuilding our relationship with the natural world, healing some of those scars, creating jobs for young people. I'm lucky enough to be president of the conservation volunteers here in the UK, TCV, and I know what an incredible impact a program of this kind would have. One of the joys of lockdown is the opportunity to read new books that I might not have read otherwise. And I've just finished a book called Losing Eden by an author called Lucy Jones. And it's an utterly astonishing book about the incredible health benefits that flow from giving people opportunities to have access to nature, not just to be in nature, but to work with nature, work with other people in making our natural environment more resilient, safer from some of the depredations of our industrialized economy. That could be a huge scheme, a massive benefit. So those are just three things. I could bang on. I mean, there is a long, long list of things where you could meet the criteria, the economic criteria, purchasing power, jobs, skills, etc., and the sustainability criteria, low carbon, nature, and all the rest of it. And I guess that's why Helen suggested that I might call this lecture Hope in Hell, because that is pretty much the main element in the book that I've just written. It's coming out actually next week, Wednesday next week. And it's called Hope in Hell because it is still a very hopeful prospect for the whole of humankind, notwithstanding the incredible dangers that we now run through accelerating climate change. And they are real and they are genuinely very scary indeed. I had to spend 3 months of my life revisiting the science of climate change, and I can tell you that was a sobering time for me, because you can't be hopeful just because you want to have hope for the future. You can only be hopeful on the basis of understanding what physical scientific reality actually looks like. So this notion of hope is, I think, critical for all of us. It's very hard for us as individuals, for us as people living in our communities, working with colleagues in companies or organizations or charities, whatever it might be. It's unbelievably difficult to do what we need to do without, at our core, having this sense of hope in a better world. And we've stacked the odds against ourselves for so long because we've just undermined the physical foundations of life on Earth. And now our hope has to be premised on addressing those crucial issues before it's too late, and doing it in such a way that we meet the palpable needs of people today for increased security, for more justice, fairness in our economy, better distribution of wealth, and speak to the young today that this is a prospect that they can help co-create and help share in the future. So for me, prospects are good theoretically. Politics is a different story. I'm not necessarily going to get into that in too much detail this evening. I get encouraged when I hear Rishi Sunak talk about the need for a green industrial revolution in this country. But I have to be honest with you, given that I've been involved in the world of the environment for nearly 50 years now. I joined the Green Party in 1974 and joined Friends of the Earth in 1972. I have heard an awful lot of high level, indeed vaulting rhetoric about the need to pay more attention to the environment. So I don't necessarily take that on trust. We have to see how that emerges, what it looks like, and the sincerity of intent that our politicians will now bring forward to do some of this crucial healing work. So Helen, I'll stop there, because I think we agreed that it'd be great to have some proper Q&A and for a chance for me to hear what other people are really interested in. It's a big area of this, as you can imagine, and I hope therefore a fitting topic for a Gloucestershire lecture.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was absolutely fantastic and a great insight. We've got a question here about, I better put my glasses on, can't read it. They're going to start coming in fast and furiously now. Do we find money for new housing by scrapping HS2 South?
I'm no great fan of HS2. I believe it was a policy that was brought forward for understandable reasons. Now, nearly 10 years ago, if you remember, the debate about HS2 started actually probably even before that. And it was all about interconnectivity between North and South via the Midlands. And of course, what we now know is that those commitments should have been made primarily by prioritising transport links in the North. And that's where the deficit has been for a very, very long time. More increased connectivity to Birmingham, shortening a journey time for London to Birmingham and beyond, is honestly neither here nor there in the great span of things. And the environmental destruction that it will cause will be enormous. But the real deficit, the mobility deficit, is for those cities, Midlands up to the north. And that's where we should have prioritized the spending. I don't know whether it's too late to cancel HS2, but reserve the investment that was promised so that we actually cut our losses here in the south and to the Midlands, in the same way as we need to cut our losses regarding the Oxford-Cambridge link, which is an utter nightmare from a sustainability point of view, and focused much more on what we could do in the north to help build prosperity through the kind of transport links that have been desperately needed for a very long time.
Absolutely. Another question here. If you were king for the day, what policies would you introduce, Jonathan? Or just one policy, perhaps. What would be the one thing?
Yeah, I oddly enough, Helen, I do think about that occasionally. You know, it's the wave of the magic green wand. I guess I would want to start with education. I am passionate about education. The first 10 years of my life were spent as a teacher in a comprehensive school in London, and I absolutely loved it and learnt at first hand the power of what education can mean to young people who otherwise don't get access to the opportunities that we perhaps take too much for granted. And I know that if we could embed a better understanding of our relationship with the natural world and how important it is that we sustain that throughout our lives, if we can do that, not just in primary school where, you know, kids love all that stuff, but as soon as they start moving through the ladder, as it were, into the secondary school and so on, it begins to wear away. And I would love to see education about the natural world sustained as a critical part of the curriculum all the way through, every single year that people are in school. Because for me, a lot depends now on the next generation, young people leaving schools today, having that embedded knowledge and wisdom and understanding things at a very deeper level. And that's not just about the science, which is critical. There's also a huge dimension about the health benefits of the natural world, as I was talking about. The spiritual side of this, for me, a very important part of my own green activism for 50 years has been a sense of the spiritual importance of the relationship between human beings and the rest of the created world. And I just know there's a richness in this and an opportunity for us to end up with a generation that would see things very differently, share a different set of values, more compassionate, more sharing, more loving, more responsible for the natural world. And that's a bit more than one policy wish, I have to admit, but I'll start there, and if you give me a few extra weeks, then I'll get it sorted.
There was a government that once had a policy around education. So,
Yep.
another question here from David Owen, who on behalf of G1st LEP, he says, we at G1st LEP are currently working on prioritising capital investment schemes for the county for growth, jobs and green recovery. If you had £20 million to spend in Gloucestershire on capital projects, what would you prioritise?
I guess what I wanted to open up in my comments was the idea that constituency by constituency, these opportunities do now exist. And what we have to be careful about is assuming that you can only make something viable if you can generate a rate of return that most investors would see to be completely reasonable. Now, I don't know what the expectation of a rate of return is that you're talking about here. But as soon as you start talking about anything requiring 8, 9, 10% rate of return on a capital project, which will be delivered over time, we're in trouble. We're in trouble because a lot of these things don't generate that kind of margin on the expenditure that's required, which is why I am really interested in a blended set of solutions, local and national, which is why I want to see governments negotiate a whole set of compacts with local authorities, where you'd have a public-private blend to secure outcomes for people that wouldn't be driven solely by high rates of return for private investors, but would be delivered as much by the public sector and by civil society to create these blended outcomes. We don't hear enough talk about that. The centralizing tendencies of Whitehall are still crushing the life out of this country. Any recovery program that I think is going to be worth its salt will certainly have to trust in our elected politicians at the local level in order to make more of this deliverable in that way. So for me, take a local approach, but meet the same criteria that I mapped out in my lecture.
Thank you. A question here. The relentless focus on getting back to high GDP growth as the holy grail is what worries me. Do we need a different measure of the progress or completely different system?
Well, that's the big one. We have obviously paid a very heavy price for having essentially only one measure of progress over the last 40, 50 years. And that one measure, of course, there have been other measures rafted in under that, but the overarching central priority of all governments has been to increase GDP year after year through increases in economic growth. And that is seen to be the only way in which we will ever achieve the kind of progress that people are looking for. Without growth, there is no progress. And yet that growth now comes at an ever higher price in terms of impact on the environment, in terms of the numbers of people that have been left behind by pursuing growth in that very crude way, in terms of some of the social regression that we've seen here in the UK. Don't forget, we've seen social mobility reduce. We've seen more children living in poverty. This is not an outcome that anybody would look for, but if you continue to say the only thing that matters is GDP measures of growth, then we will continue to suffer in that way. So we need politicians that can wise up to this. We're not ready for a no-growth society. That isn't going to happen. But we do have to rethink the balance between growth and all these other things on which our quality of life really depends. I touched quite a bit in my lecture on the importance of community cohesion and working with communities in a very different way. I look at the net contribution to wealth in society from tens of millions of volunteers, people just doing incredible things day after day in ways that never show up in the growth figures, in the GDP figures, because that's not deemed to be particularly important to what it is that makes this country strong, robust, just, resilient, and so on. And I want to see all of that non-GDP based side of wealth given a much fairer hearing in terms of how we think about progress for the future. We've got to do that. If we remain slaves of GDP and per capita increase in per capita income year after year after year, then I'm not sure there's any recovery. We will just then head gently towards a permanent decline. I'm trying to avoid being depressing this evening, Helen.
Absolutely.
So I won't go any further down that slope, but it ain't comfortable.
No, the discussions we've had in our household as well. A question from Jules Peck, who I think you know. Jonathan, as you know, I'm currently launching a new mutual bank for our region, Avon Mutual, which will be lending £500 million to our local economy. I wondered what you would like to see us do in terms of the likes of the green mortgages, community and renewables, etc.
Well, thank you. That is a really interesting question. I have been a very stalwart supporter of looking at the role of credit and alternative finance for a very long time. I've been a huge supporter of the initiatives like the Triodos Bank, Co-op Bank, and so on. And I know what Jules Peck is trying to do here with his new proposals for Avon Mutual is a really interesting extension of all of that. And again, it goes right to the heart of what are our expectations of how we can use the assets in our economies, how we can use the incredible benefit of credit. Don't forget, credit is a powerful thing. And if deployed in the right way to projects that can genuinely improve the lot of people and secure a financial outcome for investors in a mutually beneficial way, then this is a huge benefit. And actually, Helen, the more I think about this for Gloucestershire, I know there are a lot of people in Gloucestershire who are really, really interested in rethinking some of the roots of the economy. So that I was just reading the other day, there's a fascinating new initiative which will go live in Gloucestershire in the not so distant future, being run by an organization called 30 Percy. And I know that's a rather odd name, but it's an incredible investment in the talent of this county, and will inject funds and muscle and creativity and energy into Gloucestershire in a wonderful way. So I love these ideas because they encourage us to think differently about what the wealth of our county really means. And for me, I want to put a lot more emphasis on ensuring that young people are at the heart of those different ways of thinking about wealth and are given a share in planning for those different approaches and actually co-creating them, because they're the people who will benefit from us doing this in a really creative way.
And they are our future as well.
Indeed.
Our future.
Yeah.
Question here. Sustainability and sustainable development haven't featured on the national curriculum for over a decade and has been left to teachers to interweave it into the existing schemes of work. How damaging do you think that is in terms of educating the future society, and how important living sustainability in reducing our overall consumption and waste?
Thank you for allowing me to scratch a very sore spot. I was, as I mentioned before in my lecture, I was chair of the Sustainable Development Commission up until the year 2000. That was the year in which the coalition government came in, the Lib Dems and the Conservatives. And Michael Gove, at that time, was Secretary of State for Education. And within the first week of him being in the Department of Education, he swept away 6 years' worth of work that had been put in place by predecessors in that department to build a really solid, actually world-class, sustainable schools center of excellence. And I was still chair of the commission at that stage, but on my way out, I was being replaced at that time. And I have never been able to forgive Michael Gove for this. It wasn't done for any clear or apparent reason. It was a tiny amount of expenditure. It was enabling, basically, but it inspired schools the length and breadth of the country. And we were building up a formidable bank of experience and expertise across schools throughout the land. All gone in just a swipe of a Secretary of State's lazy pen for no good reasons other than what? An ideological concern that the state shouldn't be getting involved in education in that way. So I've never been able to trust a single word that has spilled from Michael Gove's mouth ever again from that moment on, and I'm still deeply suspicious of the role that he plays in the Cabinet Office today. Sorry, that's bearing a personal prejudice, but once you've seen 6 years of your hard work undone in that cavalier way, it's difficult not to feel just a touch irked. And for me, it's just been 10 wasted years. We know we have to do this in our schools. It's absolutely crucial that we give young people the literacy that they need to navigate through what is going to be a phenomenally difficult time for them. This climate story isn't going away. The climate emergency hasn't gone just because we're now having to devote so much of our energy and our lives to dealing with the COVID-19 emergency. That climate emergency is going to come back, unfortunately, with full vigor as soon as we have dealt with the pandemic. And we need to help young people understand what that means for them. We have betrayed them, frankly. And by failing to pick up the educational challenge, we're just compounding that betrayal. So I feel quite angry about this. I feel that we could have done a much better job. We've wasted 10 years, never too late. We can go back and get things right even now, but it is going to be an absolutely critical priority.
I learned from my daughters the other day a saying of, if you're not angry, you're not listening. So I think that was an apt one to put on your feelings about that. A question here, do you think the UN 17 goals are a framework we could use in the recovery phase to bring all of us together in areas of focus, and that's both globally and think globally and act locally?
I hope so. What that question refers to is something called the Sustainable Development Goals, or some people call it the Global Goals. These were the successor goals to the Millennium Development Goals, which did a good job on some counts. But these global goals were very different. They embraced pretty much every single big challenge that we face today: environmental, social, governance challenges to do with the health of our democracy and so on, big concerns about health, about education, about women's rights and empowerment. I mean, they're an amazing group, amazing collection of high-level goals with a very large number, I think 189 different targets incorporated into those goals. And it is the means by which the UN has captured the challenge for the whole of humankind to be delivered by 2030. Now, for me, it's a good framework. I'm really intrigued at companies and public sector organizations that have latched on to the Sustainable Development Goals and said, this gives us the framework we need. And we're now going to make our contribution to better lives for people in whatever way we can via the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals. So it is a powerful construct. Sometimes I think people worry too much about whether they framed everything in the right kind of way. Sometimes I just want them to get on and say, okay, I know enough about this. I'm now going to do the next obvious thing I need to do. And once I've done that one, I'll do the next obvious thing after that. And I'll just build on a record of successful, practical interventions. Don't worry too much about precision frameworks or getting everything right at that wonderful high level, in that high level way. Just go for what it is that we need to be done. But it helps to think about this in an integrated way. I'm astonished there are still so many people who zone their own sense of the world today into the environment and society and economics and ethics and philosophy and spirituality. And they have all these kind of different bits of dividing up their brain. This is at its heart a completely holistic way of looking at life on this planet of ours and understanding our responsibilities for nurturing that life. That includes ourselves, obviously, but nurturing the whole of the rest of life on Earth at the same time. And that means we have to think in much more holistic ways. And the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, probably the best thing that the UN has ever come up with to show the integrated nature of what we need to be doing to make all these things work for people.
Thank you. Here's a question now where I've lost the question. As an individual, what is the best thing we can do for the environment? I think I'd add on to that the question of how, particularly for our membership of the Honourable Company and its age profile, what can we do to be good ancestors?
Yes, thank you, Helen, for raising the question of the age profile, because if I'm talking to a group of students, I would probably say, somewhat controversially, that far and away the best thing you can do for the planet is not to have more than 2 children, and if possible, restrict yourself to 1, because it's an uncomfortable story that we have to unpack here. But unfortunately, by having more children, we are obviously increasing very significantly the impact of our footprint, including our carbon emissions, particularly in the rich world. However, I'm not going to go down that line here this evening because I think that may be irrelevant to almost everybody involved in this Zoom call. But given that, the next most impactful thing we can do, once we've done all the basic stuff about energy efficiency and how we travel and using our purchasing power responsibly, I guess there are 2 things. One, make sure that all the investments that you are lucky enough to be able to deploy in the economy, so whether it's a pension pot that you've got, or whether you've got ISAs, or whatever it might be, whatever your invested capital looks like, you need right now to work out whether those investments are working to promote the kind of better world that we've been able to share this evening, or whether in fact, without you knowing it, they're undermining the prospects for that better world. And you need to be on that, because it's part of the responsibility for us as citizens today. If we are lucky enough to have surplus to invest, and just bear in mind that there are tens of millions of people in this country who don't have surplus to invest, they can barely think about what happens at the end of next week. Part of the privilege of that is to work out how to use that money properly, responsibly. If that wasn't enough, next on my list, eat less meat. And if you could eat less meat and systematically reduce your meat consumption. I'm not urging you all to become vegetarians or vegans, but I'm a patron of a wonderful organization called Compassion in World Farming. And if you want to check out their Eat Less Meat campaign and understand how significant this is from so many perspectives, try that one out as well. That makes a big difference.
I'll be going for my vegan supper later, so I should look forward to that. A question here from the University of Gloucestershire. The University of Gloucestershire is deeply committed to a sustainability agenda and has been recognised for being a pioneer in this area. What advice would you have for universities in terms of skills and focus over the coming years to help our young people be ready for what is coming?
Yeah, this is a big one for sure. I know the university well, and I feel honoured to be associated with it. They were kind enough to give me an honorary doctorate, which has kept me informed about what the university is doing, and they are doing really well on sustainability issues. I can say that because I'm also Chancellor of Kiel University, so I'm very avidly watching the league table about which universities are doing well and which aren't. And for Kiel, we're delighted to be up there in the top cohort with Gloucestershire and other universities. This is a different story, though, for universities now, because we have an extra responsibility for those young people in our charge for however many years it may be, 3, 4 years, whatever. Because the priority has to be to enable them to gain the insights, not just the qualifications, but the insights, the wisdom, the understanding that will equip them to be good citizens of their communities and of planet Earth, and ready to deal with the incredible pressure that will come from accelerating climate change. So for me, I have a very clear view on this. No student should ever be leaving a university without a full understanding of climate change, what the science of climate change looks like, what we need to do about it, how we can be influential in affecting the discussions and the debates, and empowering young people to take on that advocacy role around climate. We're trying to do as good a job as we can at Kiel. We've got a long way to go, and I think most universities are still working hard to get that one right, to be honest.
Okay, and on a different note, where are you on the future of electric cars, and will they not achieve what the motorist wants until the battery power development has improved?
Yeah, I'm pretty enthusiastic about electric cars. I don't have a car, okay? I just have 2 bikes. That's my confession for the evening. One would probably suffice, but then I'd have to drag it back and forth between London and Cheltenham. It's just much easier to have one in Cheltenham and one in London, okay? So I haven't had a car the only time I had a car was when I was a student, typical. And I have celebrated not having a car because, to be honest, it's given me a lot of freedom. I'm genuinely pleased that we're seeing an end to the internal combustion engine coming down the pipe. That's going to happen. Even our government has set a date after which it will not be possible to buy a petrol or diesel driven car. 2040, maybe that'll come back to 2035, not very far away if you think about it. And it's going to be a good step forward in terms of emissions of greenhouse gases and reducing pressure on the environment, improving air quality and so on. But let's not get this out of perspective. Building an electric vehicle is still a very energy intensive business. Battery manufacturing is a very dirty business. There are a lot of really difficult raw materials involved in batteries, including cobalt and lithium and rare earths that we mine from the earth, often with a huge environmental footprint, often in some of the world's most impacted countries. So my dream is not actually simply to say, okay, we're not going to have any internal combustion petrol, diesel cars. We're all going to go EV. We're all going to be EV owners. My dream is, reverting back to some of my opening comments, is to think of people, particularly in towns and cities, different in rural areas, okay, and I'm very conscious of that, but in towns and cities where no individual would need to own a car ever again for themselves, because transport in that town or city would be so well organized with car share schemes, all of which would, of course, be clean electric vehicles, in the not too distant future, autonomous, self-driving electric vehicles. And you doing what young people already do, which is using Uber equivalents, car share schemes of one kind or another, to reinforce brilliant public transport and systems of enabling people to get around the place by walking and cycling, with huge health benefits, as I've already said. How far away is this? A world in which nobody needs to buy a car again and yet have all the benefits of a really efficient transport system in terms of access, affordability, etc. Well, this is a big question. For me, it needs to come in the next 10 years. For young people, that is pretty critical. They look at a lot of older people today and say, it is a bit weird that you bought this thing at a huge cost and you leave it parked outside your house for 95% of its operating life. And yet you seem to invest a huge amount of money, love and care in this hunk of metal, this sort of thing that you're obsessed with. I think young people will look back on this period of time and think that most car-loving people were just a bit bonkers, frankly. But there is the rural dimension, Helen. Sorry, I do not want to dismiss that, particularly for people who absolutely depend on their car in rural areas to get to their place of work or to have any connectivity when there's no public transport. So this is not a panacea. This is something that we could make happen in urban contexts.
Absolutely, and that's a great idea going forward. There was another question on population, which I think you've covered off in one of your answers. And here's a question. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for your presentation. I understand the UK accounts for 2% of global emissions. I wonder why we are not putting more pressure on the likes of countries like China and India, who are so heavily reliant on the whole highly polluting coal-fired generation power stations.
Mm. It is a big issue. We are a small country with a small share of total global emissions, as you've just heard. And we know that if we can't get things right in China and India, then we're not going to get it right for the world. Just to counterbalance that, please do understand that these two countries are doing a huge amount to try and combat climate change. People often think that these are countries that just burn coal because it's cheap and there and they don't give a monkeys for the state of the environment. That is not the case. China is really focused on trying to reduce coal use as fast as it possibly can, as much for the health of its citizens, where hundreds of thousands every year are killed through air pollution, far, far more every year killed through poor quality air than killed through COVID-19, far more every year. And in India, it's the same. And of course, Indian citizens have seen for the first time ever what it is like to live in a city where you can breathe. And right now in India, there are many, many cities where citizens are rising up and they're saying, we're not going back to that again. We actually love the fact that we can get up in the morning and we can do what we need to do and we can breathe without feeling asphyxiated. So these countries are doing a lot. We can help them to do much more. We can do some things which will make a huge difference for them in the future. Our investments, for instance, in offshore wind, I know this will sound like a bit of a tangent, but the one area where the UK leads the world on renewable energy is offshore wind. And by a long way, we are absolutely top of the league table on offshore wind. And it's a brilliant story. Well, this technology is going to mean a massive amount to countries around the world. The International Energy Agency, the IEA, calculated in a report at the end of last year that if we wanted to, we won't do this by the way, but if we wanted to, we could meet total electricity demand across the entire world just from offshore wind. So just let that sink in for a minute. I know it sounds improbable, but I'm not talking about Greenpeace here or Friends of the Earth. I'm talking about the International Energy Agency, okay, the go-to authority on most things to do with established energy views. We could meet the entire electricity demand of the world through offshore wind. And we have an opportunity now to work with countries like China. China has a formidable offshore wind resource off its eastern seaboard. It's incredible. India has brilliant opportunities for offshore and onshore wind. So we need to play to our strengths. We don't have a lot of things where we are literally in this space where we are top of the tree, as it were. But where we do, we should be working really hard to help them.
Absolutely. We have got so many questions, and I know we're running out of time, but as chairing the meeting, I'm actually going to go on for a bit longer than our 6 o'clock, unless the warden tells me I'm out of order. But I generally ask for forgiveness, not permission in life. So there we go. You talked about doing things locally. One of the questions here: should we try to reduce or even cease our importation of food?
Yeah, well, we are right in the middle of that critical debate now about the future of food and farming for the UK. We know for definite that we're out of the Common Agricultural Policy. That's definitely going to happen. We know that the government is prepared to maintain support for UK farmers on the same sort of basis as the CAP for at least the next 2 years. We know that we are going to move away from a system whereby farmers get paid for the amount of land they have, essentially, area-based payments, to a system where public money is only available for those farmers who help produce public goods, what are called public goods. Access, for instance, improved environmental quality, farming more to ensure that more carbon is locked up in the soil, biodiversity schemes, etc., etc. And I really welcome that. We don't actually know what that looks like at the moment, but that means that we will certainly need to move towards increased self-reliance in food supplies here in the UK. We've learnt during the COVID-19 crisis that we are very dependent on supply chains that can so easily be disrupted. And we certainly should be pressing for increased self-reliance in producing more of the food that we need, which we should be able to do, as long as we don't do any stupid trade deals with countries like America that might make that harder rather than easier. So I'm excited by that prospect. I think farmers need to be given a real sense of assurance here. It is a nightmare for a lot of farmers right now. They have no idea what kind of system is going to be in place in 2 years' time. And farmers plan on a 3-4 year cycle. Rotations are a critical part of any farmer's well-being and future viability, economic viability. So this sense of uncertainty is really hard. But I'm not a self-sufficiency man. I don't believe that we should end all imports of food into this country. I think that is unnecessary and actually not necessarily a good thing for other countries as well as for the UK. Where we can make this work in a genuinely sustainable way, you can have benefits flowing both for the exporting and the importing country.
I'm so sorry that we have to draw this to a close this evening, particularly as the questions from members and guests are still flooding in, which is a testament to the thought-provoking nature of both your lecture and your answers to the questions. I'm sure it's provided everyone with a lot of food for thought and that they will reflect on what you've been saying. And who knows, we may see some behaviour changes as well. And thank you for providing a positive outlook and showing that there is hope in hell. I was pleased to hear that you see that communities are going to be an essential part of the recovery process, which is good news for the economy of Gloucestershire, albeit that it is going to be very challenging. And whilst you talked about the healing of nature, I also took from it that we may see some healing in our civil society with the public, private and public sectors working together and the third sector working together to maybe show some more healing in the economy and society and communities of our county. So Jonathan, thank you so much for your lecture, the Gloucestershire Lecture 2020. I, for one, am pleased to hear that there is hope in hell, and I look very much forward to reading your book on its publication next week. And I would like to hand over to the Warden, Professor Chris Gaskell. Chris.
Helen, thanks very much indeed for that, and my thanks too, added to yours, to Jonathan, for, as you said, a tremendous lecture and a terrific discussion that followed. I mean, as you said, it sounded as if it could have gone on for hours. As I said at the outset, the purpose of these annual public lectures is to both inform and provoke discussion, and to do that around a topic that's important to the county, and what could be more important to the county, as indeed to the whole country, than COVID, the implications and the recovery from it. And like Helen, I was struck by the silver lining you found for us in that, silver linings around education, the environment, etc., etc. I was also struck by what you said about increased localization, and I think that's important for us as a county as we pick up some of your messages and integrate them into the local industrial strategy. I was also pleased you mentioned it because it gives me the opportunity to put in a word about an upcoming event we have with David Owen, the Chief Executive of the Local Enterprise Partnership, who we've planned to talk to the Honourable Company and guests, we hope, on July the 8th, talking to us about the local industrial strategy and how we can use the COVID-19 crisis in a positive way, not just in a negative way. So thank you again. Thank you to Jonathan. Thank you to Helen for virtually perfect chairing. I thought it was very good in a new environment for us all. Thanks very much to everybody. Thanks to the clerk for organising this. We look forward to seeing you again in person and hopefully through this medium as well in the not too distant future. In the meantime, good night and best wishes to you all, members and guests. Thank you very much indeed. Good night.